Yeah, violence in itself doesn't shock me or I think most Israelis, but everything that came out of the West following that attack was brain fucking.
Yes. We got into this because Bill asked me how we've been. And I said, well, post October 8th, it's been a roller coaster in this household, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't mind my asking, Vanessa, are you Jewish?
I am not Jewish. I have just been around many Jewish people for 10 years. I grew up on Long Island, so I think I've known more than your average American about Jewish culture growing up on Long Island, and then I've lived with a Dom for 10 years. So today we have the pleasure of Bill Deresiewicz, return guest,
fan favorite and chen favorite.
We were quite excited that you reached out to us. First of all, because we really enjoyed our conversation last time, but also last time we covered tons of topics. We were talking about art and the artist, culture, the different types of culture, solitude and friendship. And we kind of left this open-ended question of, oh, crap, we didn't get to higher education, which is something that we talk about a lot on the podcast and you write about a lot. And I think you said very generously, well, don't worry, next time. And here we are next time, aptly timed because you have just re-released Excellent Sheep. You have updated the preface. And I've heard you on a few other podcasts and you've mentioned that, people often ask you, well, it's been 10 years. Have things gotten better? And I was joking with Adam before you came on that we don't need to ask you that question because we are well aware that it hasn't gotten better. And if anything, it's gotten worse. But I think the ways that it's gotten worse are interesting to discuss and unpack. So before we get there and maybe get to today, maybe let's start by backing up and starting where you wrote Excellent Sheep in the first place 10 years ago and what you were diagnosing then. And then I think we'll throughout this conversation, fast forward to the future.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think the easiest way to explain what that book is about is to unpack the title, which is a phrase that popped out of the mouth of one of my students at Yale in kind of a tangential way relative to what we were talking about in seminar, but something must have pressed a button in her. She said, "Are you saying we're all just like really excellent sheep?" And the excellent part is interesting because excellence has become a buzzword in higher education. And I think it's become maybe like merit, except in a way that hasn't been examined because there's been a lot of pressure, I think, placed on the concept of merit because through the concept of meritocracy. But excellence is kind of a rubric that we take for granted, but it has a specific meaning and it doesn't necessarily align with what an ordinary person might think of as excellence in higher education or excellence among the kind of excellence you'd expect from an elite college student. I'm sure this goes without saying, but let me say it anyway. The whole context of the book Excellent Sheep and the phenomenon of excellent sheephood is the elite college admissions process as it was rather suddenly reoriented in the 1960s to move from a WASP aristocracy to a multicultural, gender, as we would say now, meritocracy, and how it's evolved since then. Right. And anyone who's anyone who's gone through the selective college admissions process since then understands, APs and SAT scores and extracurriculars and leadership and service and all this bullshit. Right. What excellence is that it is what an admissions committee will recognize as having met those marks. But it doesn't necessarily have much to do with actual excellence, like being able to think well, being intellectually curious, having some kind of self that, can act as a moral agent in the world. preparing yourself to actually contribute in a positive way to society. So all that, and this sort of very artificial excellence that students have learned, students from these kinds of milieu that produce lots of selective college graduates have learned to produce, that's the excellent part. And the sheep part is one of the results of that whole thing, which is a lot of them, many of them, most of them don't have a strong sense of what they want to do with their lives because they don't have that strong self, because they've just been doing what the grown-ups have been telling them to do in order to produce excellence or merit. And they feel lost. And this is what I saw among my students. I mean, so that's sort of the analytic understanding of the book, the historical biographical understanding is that I saw this among my students, 10 years at Yale, being a professor, listening to students, published an essay about some of this stuff in 2008, got a huge response, dozens, scores, hundreds of emails from these kinds of kids, recent graduates of these schools, telling me, above all, the one piece of it that I hadn't realized even when I was a professor, which was how incredibly miserable it was making them all. So that's where we were 10 years ago. Right. And as you suggested, we can talk about what's happened since then.
Mm. Yeah, but I mean, I think there is a lot to unpack even with just that. So let's stay there for a little bit, I think. I mean, I would imagine that one of the elements of the admissions process is not just that they're looking for bullshit, but I would imagine there's an economic component as well. Like they're seeking people of means. And I know that there has been a push to bring supposedly more diverse folks from different backgrounds, but it seems like there's been an economic shift as well in the way that colleges are operating, which then is changing their college admissions process as well, I would imagine.
An economic shift to looking for more affluent students?
That's my question. I'm wondering because because I know that you've written a little bit about how, in the 60s, it was much more common for universities for public universities to have a lot of public subsidy and for college to be quite affordable. And that's also shifted quite radically. And I would imagine that there's some correlation as well with the way that the college admissions process is being run.
I think money is important, but I think maybe not in the way you've outlined. So first of all, we always have to say when we're talking about higher education that it's a very heterogeneous sector. There are all kinds of different schools. There are all kinds of different students. If we're talking about selective colleges, which is what we are talking about, I make no pretense to sort of be talking about the whole universe of higher education in general, which includes about 2,700 four-year institutions, and then there's also, community colleges, about 2,700, and maybe about 250 in the broadest definition could be understood as selective. Most of the most highly selective are private institutions. So it's really more about private institutions, but even the public institutions, I think, especially the highly selective ones, University of Virginia, Michigan, the California, University of California schools. As you say, they're getting more and more expensive. They're getting less and less money, in terms of tuition. They're getting less and less money from their respective states. So they also have more and more of an incentive to enroll affluent students. I would actually say the shift towards affluent students has probably been greater at the public universities. There's a book about this called Paying for the Party, which is about, and so the party is sort of the stereotypical like upper middle class frat bro that these public universities have been wanting to appeal to because they need people who can pay full tuition and especially full out of state tuition, which is, more to attract kids from outside of Ohio to, places like Ohio State. At the private schools, the Ivy League, Stanford, Duke, all that crap, which is mainly what I'm talking about. The dirty secret is that not only is that they are still schools for the wealthy. I mean, how much of a secret is it really? It's just that they were, the schools for the old aristocracy, the Protestant boys, the bankers' sons. And then they diversified in all these different ways. And that was that admissions revolution was a real thing. And it really did create a new leadership class. And whatever it was that forced them to do it, they deserve a lot of credit for that. They really do. But what's happened since then is that upper middle class families have figured out how to game the system, right? Basically how to stuff their kids with a kind of merit that's recognized by the admissions process. But it's not like the universities, the universities have been silently complicit with this, is what I would say. They're perfectly happy that this is happening because as large as some of their endowments are, they also still need affluent families. For one thing, they need affluent donors. And if you grow up rich, you're more likely to stay rich. But also, they still need a lot of full payers, right? So Harvard students, I've had Harvard students write to me, defensively and say, hey, 60% of us are on financial aid. And I'll say, yeah, that's great. 40% of you aren't. 40% of you come from families that can plunk down 300 now. Maybe it's, we're talking about $100,000 a year, 400,000, just write a check. So, and we have statistics about it, right? There's a great database in the Times. It's from a few years ago. I don't think there's any reason to think things have changed much. And one of the things it showed is that there are like 36 schools, including most of the Ivies, that have more kids from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the bottom 60%. And typically at the most selective schools, I would say about 3/4 of students come from the top 20%. Schools do not want, people have done work about this. There used to be a theory, there was an educational economist named Carolyn Hawksby who said, the reason elite schools don't have more kids from across the spectrum, the economic spectrum, is recruitment, right? Those kids don't know about it. They don't know that there's all this financial aid available. They don't see these schools as places they can go to. And that sounded plausible, but then some years later, someone else, I forget his name, followed up on this hypothesis and said, now that the schools have been really making an effort to address this, we can see that's actually not true. The schools really just don't want to have that many kids like that.
And it also changes the mindset too. It's the student becomes essentially the customer. And so your job is not necessarily to educate them as much as it is to give them a good time while they're in your campus
custody.
halls. Yeah.
Yes, and this manifests in so many different ways. We can go down this road if you want, or just make it a short digression. But the whole bureaucracies of safety, DEI, what's happened to Title IX, this enormous ballooning of student-facing administrators, that's part of it. Great inflation is part of it. I think in some ways the shift away from the humanities and other core liberal arts subjects is part of it. I think it's manifested in the shape that campus protests have been taking. I imagine you might want to get to that at some point.
Yes, we probably will.
What we see going on right now. All of this, basically, universities, I think this is true of adults in general, but universities in particular have, to a very significant extent, surrendered their claims to authority. Like, authority is a dirty word. And I remember, I think it was Louis Menand, with whom I have a lot of disagreements, but has written, extremely well about higher education in many ways for a long time. He talks about, this was already years ago, he talked about the difference between what the catalogs look like now and what they used to look like. And they used to, now it's all the smiling faces and blah, 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 and extracurricular opportunities. And they used to be like densely printed pages of course offerings. And as he put it, it was very clear on whose terms the transaction was being conducted. And now it's equally clear that the terms are the students' terms, not the faculty's. And just one last thought. It used to be administrators plus faculty versus the students. Now it's administrators plus students versus the faculty.
Right. I think
how
this
recent is that phenomenon? Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should get into this a little more.
Well, that phenomenon is a different way of phrasing the whole customer service mentality thing. And, it's always hard to date because all of these trends are really the trends that have been accumulating gradually for a long time. But I think people started to talk about the customer service mentality probably in the 90s. But it's really, but one of the big things it's related to, which is this defunding of public higher education and therefore a shift to a tuition model, started, I think, as early as the early 70s.
It's funny because it does, the result that we're seeing in how this affects the ability of faculty to really engage in, I hate this word, but difficult subjects is so clear because the universities would hire intellectuals that have proven themselves precisely because of their willingness to do some serious research with some degree of intellectual integrity, but then constricted in their ability to bring this into the class, because if this should unnerve the students, they're not providing the right service, and that's such a bizarre equation. Like it's almost like you're plucking the people who you aim to pluck the people with the highest talent for the kind of critical rigor that you would want from an academic, and then completely neuter their work in order for it to be digestible for the most fragile, whiny, or in a more sinister way, power striving student.
That's absolutely correct. And I should say my education in this whole piece of it, which for lack of a better word, we can call wokeness, and all the phenomena that signifies. I left academia in 2008, left Yale, left academia. But in the spring of 2015, I taught for one semester at Scripps College, which is one of the 5 Claremont, elite liberal arts colleges in the Los Angeles area. And it was a very rapid education in how campus politics had been reshaped. And, people who had been following this already will point to like 2013, 2014 as the inflection point. It has to do with Twitter. It has to do with Tumblr and how sort of that became a dissemination tool for a lot of the political concepts that had been incubated in the academy. So I stepped back on campus after 7 years, and it hits me in the face right away.
It's kind of funny, by the way, just as a note, the Tumblr theory of SJW origin, right? I don't know what I think about this, but it always makes me chuckle to think that there is a narrative. There is one historical narrative that traces a lot of the madness that we're experiencing on campuses today, and that is leaking into the public sphere more broadly to Tumblr culture.
No, I maybe what you're saying, and I feel this sometimes too, is that it seems like a little too narrowly determined. Like, so if there hadn't been a Tumblr, none of this would have happened. I don't think that's true, but it does sound just like Twitter's been the conduit for a lot of things.
Right. No, and I don't want to underplay it either, because when I engage the arguments, they're compelling. There is a lot of I think Yasha Monk made that point also in his I think most recent book, right? That we and there is a case. It's just amusing. I remember Tumblr is the website that I couldn't make sense of. I didn't even realize when I was using Tumblr. This is totally relevant digression, but when I was using Tumblr, I didn't even realize that it had a community, let alone like how to use its blogging capacity. So for me, as a honorary boomer, I think to discover that there was all this subculture that was hidden from me, and not only that might have been way more determinant of where we are now culturally than all of the intellectual history that I've studied, is both funny and humbling.
Fair enough, but I want to underscore that it's not either or. I mean, it's a fair description to say that the kind of theoretical, ideological,
or more furry culture on Tumblr, hard to say.
Well, but this is the thing, is that so what you just shorthanded as Foucault, which I encountered when I got to graduate school in '89, has leapt the walls of the academy. Right, the monkeys have gotten out of the zoo, and now they've taken over. But it's a fair question: how did that happen? And my assumption had been, well, these, radical faculty had been tenured radicals, had been reproducing themselves through the classroom for a long time. But But they've been doing that for a long time, right? I mean, again, when I was in graduate school starting in 89, everyone else was trying to do that, right? Whether it was graduate students who were like bringing in Foucault and Marx to freshman composition, or tenured faculty who were trying to reshape, the world. And to me, it seemed completely futile. I enjoyed laughing at them behind their back. Like, you're not going to, you're not producing generations of Marxists. I mean, I can see this is the 90s, right? I mean, I was a graduate student at Columbia. Columbia College graduates were not like going out to be Marxists. They were going out to be bankers, right? So how did it happen that I ended up being completely wrong about this? Well, I had trouble believing that it could be Tumblr myself when I first read the argument, but it sort of makes more and more sense, right? But anyway, the point is, 2015 is now 9 years ago I was there. And faculty were telling me how afraid they were to cross their students in any way. I mean, everyone was already terrified. My students, these like self-described strong feminists at Scripps College, the women's college, were telling me how terrified they were. Now, I don't want to throw too much in the mix.
Of each other, not of the faculty.
Of each other. Of what they called, wokeness wasn't a term yet. They called them the PC police. So this is where we were already in 2015.
And these are faculty who aren't necessarily tenured, right? These are folks that actually could lose their jobs, theoretically.
Well, that's the next important point to make, right? The ones who were most telling me that were the adjunct writing instructors. Look, I think the non-adjuncts, the tenured people, were only marginally less cowardly. I mean, I shouldn't even say cowardly. If you're an adjunct, you're not making a lot of money anyway, and you can't afford to lose your job.
You actually have something at risk.
Right. But I'm sure, I know this is a well-worn theme by this point, although it's probably continues to be worth emphasizing, that for all kinds of social reasons, all kinds of reasons of self-image, maybe the fact that they have kids themselves, especially teenage kids, faculty with perfectly secure tenured positions have been just as afraid as any adjunct to say anything that's remotely. It's like they just don't need the headache of getting into it with their students, getting into it with the Title IX office, getting denounced on social media because they didn't use the N-word. They mentioned the N-word because they were, reading something out loud from, it could be a civil rights activist, could be Baldwin or whoever, but, you can't. Right. So
it's like the opening scene of American Fiction.
Yeah, exactly. So they shut up, they retire if they're old enough, whatever it is.
And but by the way, the whole thing about the non-tenured, just as another side point that was also at this point, I think a cliche in our conversations, but the fact that on one hand the positions are so fragile, so tenuous, and at the same time there is probably a high production of, what's the phrase? What's the Turchin phrase? Elite overproduction of people who would compete for these positions makes you absolutely interchangeable in a system that doesn't really value the quality of your work. So I remember this experience. I was not in academia, thank God, professionally, but I was in no worse a crucible of CNN, and I can't get out of my mind the templates that shape my worldview now, just how interchangeable this place made you feel institutionally, and not just for somebody like me who was in my earlier stages of my career, but for executive producers, people who have been there for 20 years and still felt like they could be replaced at any moment, because there are thousands of people literally who would be happy to fill in their positions. So sure, you provide some quality of intellectual service to this supposedly intellectual institution, but if we're honest, the product is a little different than what you think it is when you got hired, and we have people lining up to fill your spot. And I think this is the kind of the same thing, in the sense that the value of the adjunct professor is, we need somebody in this position and you need to be good, but you are not the higher. If you were the person that we really want as our prized name, that we want to make sure that is put on our promotionals, and we think we can draw more clients, more customers, then you would be tenured. So you as an adjunct, you're automatable. You're automatable.
Or at least, as you say, interchangeable.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, and I just want to extend it to the students themselves. I mean, I have a tendency to talk. I think all of us, over 30s have a tendency to talk as if these kids were, horrible Stalinists, and a few of them are, and a few of them consciously are not. And I think this is true widely in liberal spaces, have realized that they can weaponize this kind of rhetoric for career advancement. But I think most students feel very insecure. I mean, this is part of what the whole selective college admissions process is about, no matter what your demographic. This sense of scarcity, right? I mean, if you're trying to get into a school that has an admissions rate of 4%, then you know very well just how interchangeable you are. You know how tenuous your grip on your place is. And you're going to be just as cowed. I have a friend who teaches at a big elite university, and he put it beautifully. He said, the one thing these students know how to do is hack the meritocracy. In other words, they got to these schools by reverse engineering the meritocracy. Who do I have to be? I mean, this is a beautiful restatement of what I'm saying in Excellent Sheep. Who do I have to become in order to look like the person they want me to look like? In a way that was not true when I wrote Excellent Sheep, but has become true. I mean, Excellent Sheep 2014, it was already happening. I just didn't know it. Is that a big part of hacking the meritocracy is learning to talk this talk.
And the talk being the kind of radical
Wokeness.
woke.
Yes, okay. Yes. The whole meal, the whole social justice, oppressor, oppressed meal. It's just become part of, like once upon a time you'd play polo, and now you talk about, you flash the hand signals in the form of the DEI jargon.
And like when you were talking earlier about like when you first started writing the book, you were seeing your students just very lost, like no strong sense of self. And in a way, I think that could be okay that somebody comes to a college to kind of quote unquote find themselves, to get exposed to lots of different subjects, to have some sort of, grappling with a thing they'd never grappled with before. And then all of a sudden, ideally, I suppose, leave college with a stronger sense of self and identity. So I don't think, I just wanted to press back on that point for a moment, because I think the fact that they're lost isn't necessarily the issue in and of itself. It's that the college experience is kind of almost taking advantage of that lostness and supplanting the search for meaning or values or direction with a kind of checklist that students are like, and rather than meaning, they're just going for the checklist. And when they graduate, they don't necessarily have a sense of moral compass moving forward. They just have a little piece of paper that tells them how to keep going to the next thing that will give them validation.
Yeah, no. So I think you're right. And I talk about this in Excellent Sheep, that a big part of what college should be for is, for lack of a better term, finding a self, building a self, testing possibilities for the self. I'm not concerned that students feel lost or uncertain when they get to college. I'm concerned that they feel, if anything, even more lost because career is now staring them in the face when they leave. So it's partly that, for reasons that you just suggested, college is not helping them at all. College doesn't see itself as being in the business of helping them do that. Their rhetoric might still be there, but they really have no idea. It's just another set of checklists. It's that, but also, I think there may be a difference, even in terms of how who the student is when they get to college. Now, I don't want to idealize things. There was no golden age, blah blah blah. But I think I can put it this way: that there used to be more students, and we can certainly imagine a situation in which there are more students who get to college okay, they're uncertain, their self is still in formation, but they have a sense that their job is to conduct this search, is to figure out who they are or start to figure out who they are. That college is part of their project. And I had students like this, and they were rare, but they, it's like they were driving the car. Like I'm here to further a project of self-development that I've begun to intimate already. And I want, and hopefully college is going to help me do that. Not just classes, but what I do with my peers and so forth. They seemed more realized already, or more on the way to being realized, or like there was a center there already. Like
something realizable.
When you were in office hours, you felt like you were already talking to a person rather than a resume. And I think that I absolutely, I mean, again, another way of phrasing my indictment is it's just harder and harder and harder to be that person when you're 18, because everything is the checklist. Everything is the endless succession of hoops. And there's never a moment in these elite upbringings to even float the idea of having this kind of project or this kind of self. It's all just do this, so that you can get to such and such goals in the very distant future.
Yeah. And by the way, I very much relate to that with my own personal experience of going to college. I think I had a big kind of identity crisis when I didn't get into an Ivy League, because I went to a very competitive public high school where the everybody was trying to get into an elite college. That was the goal. And I measured my worth by my grades. And I thought I was on the path to an elite institution. And when I didn't get into one, I had no idea how to find any worth in myself anymore. And so I had to kind of construct that for myself. And it took a long time, because like I went to a college that I ended up not liking very much. And I found very few actually interesting intellectual courses. And it kind of maybe reinforced my like kind of chip on my shoulder that I was better than this experience, and that that this was not, that I could have done something more or better. I would have had a more interesting 4 years. But I think the more important thing was that I figured out after college actually how to value myself outside of the construct of grades, and that I realized in retrospect that it was probably a good thing I hadn't gotten to an elite college, because I never would have necessarily had that life lesson, and I would have assumed that I was the anointed elite that I always assumed I was as a high school student.
Yes. No, I think what you said is very important. I mean, first of all, that psychology that you described is the psychology. It was, and in some sense still is, my psychology. Like, I am a worthwhile human being because I have all these elite credentials, and while it might sound like sour grapes, like I'm glad I didn't get into an Ivy League, I absolutely think it's true that at some point in your life you need to have this rendezvous with yourself where you say, am I really only, as David Foster Wallace said, am I really only as good as my last sales quarter? Because the thing is, if you had got into an Ivy League school, there wouldn't have been the end of this emptiness. It just keeps going and going and going. You can never be as good as you think you should be. Any even slight failure, like an A- is a sort of an existential crisis. And I think a lot of people just keep going in that direction. And by the way, inflicting, I think, a great deal of misery on the people around them, because they have they've never figured out how to validate themselves outside the validations of this kind of status. I mean, we don't have to get into this, but I had various failures along the way, and they were incredibly bruising. And I think that ultimately they forced me to detach myself from this. Yeah, and it makes you a strong person. You know, it makes you able to resist conformity.
Which is a hard road, and I don't know if this is actually takes me a little bit to one of my questions around potential point of disagreement, which is with I think that in what I'm reading in your writing is that if we were able, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, if we were able to kind of restructure the economics of higher education, that if it were free, let's say, then many more people would opt into the liberal arts education, and this would be a way of kind of bringing back that critical thinking that we've allowed to diminish in our higher education system, and it would become the institution that it was kind of meant to be, which is to instill this kind of critical thinking, to not be so conformist, to create individuals as opposed to sheep. And I've kind of lost faith that even in that scenario where the liberal arts takes hold once more, that it is the right mechanism for creating nonconformist thinking or people. I'm actually not so confident anymore that the institution is up to the task anymore, but maybe that's a little cynical for some, I don't know.
No, I'm not sure either. And first of all, let me say that I don't say, or I certainly didn't mean to say that if only we did this and this, we would return to, because first of all, a lot of this is being driven by economic inequality, right? So if it's a society of a few winners and a lot of losers with nothing in the middle, then people are going to be driven like panicked sheep to the elite institutions that presumably guarantee that they're going to be among the winners. And then even if we eliminated the economic inequality, there would always still be status competition. And there would always still be people, who think that if they get into Harvard, they're superior. And if they don't get in, then they're worthless. I mean, that's always going to continue. But I do think it's true. And I point to the 60s because there's this really stupid, lazy argument that you often hear from members of the elite, people who went to Harvard and Princeton, people who majored in the humanities, that like to pretend, to like to talk about how this is all just elite privilege. It is elitist to think that anyone who didn't go to a prep school would ever have any interest in majoring in English or history or philosophy. And I will simply say, look at the 60s. Look at the distribution of majors then. And I point to the 60s because it was sort of the culmination of this great expansion of public higher education, right? Schools like the University of California were still free. We had, the college enrollments between like 1940 and 1980 quintupled. We were opening campuses at the rate of one a week. So huge new classes of people were entering the system. And what were they majoring in? Well, this was the heyday of the liberal arts. It turns out that working class kids and middle class, lower middle class kids can figure out for themselves that this stuff's really interesting and they want to study it. And if they have the economic freedom to do it, it was also, in terms of the larger economy, we were still in the Great Compression where inequality was lessening. So please don't tell me that this is just, for prep school kids and nobody else is interested. Many other people are interested. They just do not have the economic room to do it. If we gave them that room, which of course would be a huge thing, making college free again.
Yeah, that's like that's the big step one.
Yeah. But, would it lead to sort of this civic revival and this revival of critical thinking? I don't know. I mean, I think it could, but what I think it would mainly lead to was people just being a lot more fulfilled in college. And that to me is enough of a reason. Students seem to be so disenchanted with their college experience now for so many reasons. And we spend so much time, 4 years out of everybody's life, or, the life of half the people in the country, and so many hundreds of billions of dollars on this thing. And people hate it so much that just addressing that, I think, would be worth doing.
It's so difficult because there's very little I disagree with you, but also I just don't know what it means to do it. In terms of the only reality that I'm imagining for something fundamentally to change about the economic system is that is not full government control or takeover is, and this is my fantasy, the self-discrediting of these institutions that will create a deflationary overall effect where people just wise up to the scam that is higher elite education. And I can only see that happening reputationally.
People have been talking about this a lot, especially since October 7th. And, Barry Weiss in the Free Press loves to run stories. There was one, I think, literally today about how more and more students are opting for Southern universities. Although, that seems to have more to do with COVID policy. This is already several years old. But the point is, everyone sort of in, let's say, the left critical space wants to believe that there's going to be this reputational collapse.
So I don't know. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I dream.
I don't believe it's going to happen
because people will still want to send their children to Harvard, but just to totally support your hunch in this. Like I've been moving in that direction for years, and it's funny. I think it was right before October 7th that I started thinking about how I would feel very fulfilled with my career if I've contributed to the collapse of one Ivy League school. Don't care which. But and then October 7th happened, and of course I'm starting to think of this as a mission more than a wish list, right? But I've had this conversation with a friend of mine. I think I can say, right, with Yael Bartor is a friend of mine. And she's very open and public about being, she's Israeli, and she's also at the front of pro-Israeli and anti-Hamas supporters awareness post October 7th. And she's a Harvard grad. And we talk about the problem in universities, especially now, and we can get into it later, what's happening at Columbia and campuses around the country, Yale, NYU. And then we always reach this point of friction where I get all like my eyes widen in just daydreaming about the day where it's a point of shame, where it's a blot of shame to say that you went to an Ivy League school, right? That people will have to be to cross it out of their resume. That's my fantasy world. While for her, she's dreaming of the day when she can once again proudly declare that she went to Harvard. She wants to still be able to cash out that experience, that part of her resume. And the fact that even somebody like her, who is so aware of the systemic flaws that are directly tied to some of the behaviors that we're seeing in terms of I don't want to call it necessarily violence, but the radical behavior, let's call it, the reckless radical anti-Israel behavior that is happening on campus, and this obviously has some implications beyond the Israel question. As somebody who's so fully aware of how this connects to the systemic flaws in the higher elite education system, she still wants to be able to cash it out. And if she can't change her mind on this, then I don't think anybody can. Even Bill Ackman, who was the crusader against Harvard specifically, but then Ivy Leagues more generally, it was a flicker of a moment before either washing into the background or just accepting that reform has to happen from the inside. You need to fix the system rather than completely break it. And to me, I'm like, no, just let it go. Let it go.
Right. Well, look, I don't think you can expect Harvard graduates to want to devalue Harvard. Right. I mean, that's part of it, right? Their sense of self and their place in the world is really dependent on the reputation of Harvard, and they're not going to want to. But
do you think
also,
that somebody like Bill Ackman, who's already, but it goes
so deep, right? I mean, people have talked about this. We don't have, unlike in Europe, there's no hereditary aristocracy, and so symbolic status adheres to an enormous extent in the school you went to, right? There's not that much else that bears that just in and of itself is a symbolic token. So in other words, not how much money you have or what job you have, but just a symbolic token that marks status. Americans, this is what, I've heard Europeans say this, that Americans are obsessed about where they went to school in a way that very few other people are. Maybe if you went to Oxbridge, you're like this, but it sort of pervades all the way down, right? It's not just I went to Harvard, but it's like I went to the University of Alabama if I'm in Alabama, right? So it's all the way down. Like, this is really determining. But also, I think the reason we're unlikely to see this kind of collapse, well, a couple of things. First of all, as appalled as we might be about the state of campus politics, it is still, these kids are still expressing the politics of the liberal elite in general, right? Like the people who hire for NPR and the Times and et cetera, they're seem to still be aligned with the campus radicals, right? So it's not effective.
Well, that's something that has been. It's a funnel, right? It's a pipeline. So of course, but the pipeline,
right? So
but the pipeline is independent, I think, of the precise details of the ideology. Of course, the ideology is left of center, but what constitutes left of center has clearly shifted over the past 10 years, 20 years. And that is partly the result of the education system. And you can see how these intergenerational conflicts take place as graduates go from colleges into places like NPR, into the New York Times, and then they come into conflict with people who graduated from the same places 15 years before. So it's not like the education system doesn't matter. It's not just that the elite has changed its view because of a general shift in the zeitgeist that is also reflected in the education. I think the education is ground zero of these changes.
Yeah, we could pick this apart. There's generational conflict, but it seems that the young people are winning, right? Because actually, they're the junior staffers, the senior staffers, people like Yuri Berliner. But then they're the people who actually run the place, like Catherine Marr, right? And they're clearly aligned, just like on campus, right? It's the administrators with the youngest people against the older stratum, right?
Do you think that? Yeah.
So the point is, kids coming out with kids with radical politics. This is not hurting them,
right?
Right?
No, for sure.
So the key word here is pipeline. As long as the elite pipeline continues from elite universities to elite employers, either because the elite employers are aligned with the campus politics or because they don't care. Okay. So after, there were a few high profile cases, like I guess was it the president of the NYU Law Students Association who had a job offer rescinded. And then Bill Ackman making noise, we're going to blacklist these students. I don't know to what extent that's happened. But even if it's happened a little bit, I'm sure that it's just a little bit. And I'm sure that the top three consulting firms and the big Wall Street banks are still hiring overwhelmingly from the most prestigious institutions, regardless of what's happening in those campuses. And until that changes, these institutions, these schools will maintain their reputational primacy. And therefore, the entire upper middle class is going to continue to try to get their kids into them. That's the key. That is the key, even more than the college admissions process. It's really the entry point into elite employment. That is the key choke point of the system. That where change would have to happen. And I just don't see it happening there. And maybe that's because ultimately all of these people know that the politics is just a game. The politics is just an elaborate method of in-group signaling.
The one thing that has been puzzling to me, though, because a lot of my...
I just want to make an asterisk there because I will forget.
Yes.
I want you to have your question. I'm just making to myself that the politics is just a game is such an interesting point that I need to push back on.
We'll put a pin in it.
Yeah, so we'll get back to it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can also put a hold on my thought if you want to.
I mean, you know your thought now better if it's like you decide.
Well, I guess it's related to the game, but it's the thing that's been puzzling me a little bit is because I have a lot of friends who are more sympathetic to the protesters than otherwise, and what I hear from them is that they feel persecuted. Like they feel like they're being censored, that there's the other side has much more power in this equation, and the people who have the real power are against them, and that they're being
we're talking
censored.
about the protests right now going on in
Colombia,
NYU, in the context of ramping up the anti-Israel demonstrations, which right now play out as what do they call it? Liberated zones in the quads of these campuses.
Yeah. And obviously, like whether it's true or not, the narrative of we're persecuted and censored is very galvanizing. So it's a useful narrative. But what I'm more interested in is it's
also the only narrative that they know, I would argue.
Yeah, possibly. But I'm trying to figure out to what extent is there some validity in it, in that there are the people who are calling the shots, a lot of them are of a different persuasion.
Look, I mean, I feel like this is going to jump us to a different conversation. But I actually, as much as I despise the protesters for so many reasons, I think that's a fair point. I think I've been appalled at the extent to which pro-Palestinian voices, whatever I think of them, have been subject to various forms of suppression. Deplatforming of speakers, cancellation of prizes or whatever, all kinds of things. I mean, it's just really disgusting.
Right. And I just want to emphasize this point, but also to give it context. This is not so much in the context of the current protests, but early in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there were a bunch of deplatforming of Palestinian voices, which I totally agree was repugnant. And some of them were borderline because, you could say that there was an actual Hamas supporter. And I still don't think that there should be a problem with this. There's a Hamas supporter, just contextualize the person as a Hamas supporter.
Right.
But I can understand. I don't like it, but whatever. But there were cases that were absolutely obnoxious. Like, I don't remember, I think this is the person you were referring to. I don't remember the name, but there was an author who was supposed to go to a literary festival that got canceled. And that was just dumb.
Yeah.
Not so much in the protest right now, as far as I see it, but
I mean, it's complicated.
But I'm sure that some assholes will try to cancel people unnecessarily because this is the currency, right?
Right. But and this is to a certain extent a journalistic question that we may not fully have the answers to sitting here right now, or anybody have the answers to at this point. But in the context of the conversation we've been having, the key question is not whether someone's going to get deplatformed while they're on campus, or even some kind of sanction from the university, but first of all, is this going to affect their postgraduate employment prospects of these individuals? But really what we're talking about is the biggest picture. Is this perceived shift towards a kind of horrifying radicalism on elite college campuses going to persuade the actual elite, the people who do the hiring at prestigious institutions, to turn their backs on graduates of these schools, whether they happen to be in the encampment at Columbia or not? Are they going to suddenly stop hiring Princeton graduates, Yale graduates for their consultancies? Because if they do, that's going to change everything in terms of the place of these schools in American society. But I don't see that happening.
And by the way, I will be very disappointed if ultimately the reason McKinsey stops hiring from Ivy Leagues is because of the Jews in Israel. I will be very disappointed, because they should stop hiring from Ivy Leagues, because the pipeline needs to be broken. Also, McKinsey is a parasitical institution, but that's...
Yeah.
So both of them should stop existing. But
yes, they should.
I'm like,
yes.
But law firms, let's say elite law firms, I do believe that elite law firms serve a utility in this country and should hire lawyers, just not from the Ivy Leagues, or at least not to default to the Ivy Leagues.
It is interesting, Adam, that you're so radical on this particular topic, because like often in certain things where we are having conversations, about things like liberal democracy and why we shouldn't, necessarily go to the burn it all down or capitalism. Let's reform. And yet when it comes to higher education, Adam is full on torches.
Yeah, because I think the difference is that I'm not against liberal education and I'm not against notionally higher education, but the elite institutions that we're talking about, they're specific, they are limited. I call them the Ivies, but obviously it's more broader than just the actual Ivy League. But it's not that broad. Those are private elite colleges, and it's not all elite colleges, but it's a subset of elite colleges that right now are more predatory than they are fulfilling their purpose. Yeah. They're not shaping a better individual. They're shaping worse individuals. They are predatory when it comes to the costs, and ultimately the reform needed is to burn their entire business model right now and restructure. So yeah, I'm radicalized on them. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that would happen if we really reinvested in public higher education is that there'd be a shift of the sort of the human capital of our 18-year-olds towards public institutions. And, it could be more thinkable for elite employers, many of whom maybe also shouldn't exist either, but to move more towards what so many people are constantly begging them to do, which is hire more people from public universities. Look, the last couple of chapters in Excellent Cheap, I talk about, I shift from talking about students in schools altogether to talking about the elite that the system has produced. And what I think George Packer and others for a long time now have been talking about elite failure. And I say, look at the profile that I've been developing in the rest of the book of the elite college student, the elite college graduate, and notice that it is exactly the same profile as our leadership class. They are risk averse. They're self-serving. They're intellectually narrow, intellectually undernourished. They exist in a bubble. They don't know, they're cut off from the rest of society. I mean, for decades now, this system has been producing our leadership class. And that to me is, and the quality of our leadership class is the biggest indictment of the system that you're talking about. Right? I mean, that's the real problem. I mean, the tuition dollars, whatever, the unhappiness of students, I mean, that's a bigger issue for me. But really,
you mean if the cost was worth it, then sure, charge a lot for the quality of producing a wonderful elite, which is actually what you're talking about, right? Your point about the quality of our leadership is the quality of our elite. The whole point of an elite is to cultivate what should be the model citizen of a society, and aspirationally what people would want to aim to. And the result is a very shallow, anxious,
self-serving
shell of an individual, self-serving.
Yes, that's correct.
Individual exhibiting often psychotic behavior, sociopathic behavior, not psychotic, sociopathic behavior in the degree of self-serving and lack of social responsibility.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
I feel like we haven't exactly outlined what exactly has changed, gotten worse since you wrote the book. We've kind of alluded to it in a lot of ways, but I do think it's worth just concretizing, because Adam and I talked before you got on, but it perhaps got worse in a way that you didn't necessarily expect. What the lack of critical thinking has wrought in terms of the rage and the moral righteousness, with no channel for understanding or processing, and now that being unleashed on the campuses we see today. But I would like to hear your interpretation of how you think it's gotten worse today.
So I think two big things, both of which see the inflection point of which, again, seems to have been around 2013, 14, just as I was finishing the book, also related to each other. One, we've been talking about wokeness, for lack of a better term. I think that I've written about this, a number of pieces. Wokeness was able, I think, to take over so quickly because what I was describing in Excellent Sheep was a moral vacuum. Universities had become institutions in service of neoliberalism. Whatever their rhetoric was, the only value was, as I've put it, producing producers. The older missions of kind of the old civic mission and the old cultural mission embodied in great books courses were both discredited in the 60s and largely abandoned. So so the purpose became, we were just talking about this self-serving meritocracy. The purpose just became careerism. And I think that this was really unsatisfying to everyone. I think schools and professors didn't really want to look themselves in the face and acknowledge this is what they were doing. And students, many of them, they have the hungers of youth, including idealism and moral passion. And wokeness is this kind of ready-made morality that you can just plug and play. And virtually overnight, schools began to, never mind the students, schools began to speak of themselves in terms of things like changing the world, making the world a better place, social justice. Our highest mission is, again, I know this is a news organization, but just as Uri Berliner just recently described at NPR, our mission is not journalism. Our mission is, to build a righteous society. Our mission is not educating students. Our mission is to build a righteous society. So that's a big piece of what's changed. That wasn't yet the case. I mean, in Excellent Sheep, I described this moral vacuum. And now it's been filled, and it's been filled in the worst possible way. The related thing we've also touched on that's enabled wokeness to take over so quickly is social media. But which also didn't exist. I mean, it was in its early stages, right? So again, 2013 is when I finished the book. 2008 is when I left Yale, left academia. So it's not just, I mean, Jonathan Haidt and others have talked about this, right? So it's not just Facebook, it's Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, plus the smartphone. And in fact, specifically like the iPhone 4 and later generations, and the like button and the share button, right? That's really, and that whole ecosystem is put into place in the early 2010s. And aside from its larger political ramifications, it also deeply has affected the personal element that we started this conversation by talking about, this intense mental distress, this culture of constant comparison, right? I'm constantly looking at myself in relation to my peers and measuring my worth, right? So all of again, Jonathan Haidt, I guess is how you pronounce his name, or Jean Twenge, or Abigail Schreier, like they've talked about how the inflection points in these sort of mental health curves around 2012. But what's ironic is, so I write Excellent Sheep without any of that data, and I'm already writing about a mental health crisis that the people I'm reading had started to document in the very early 2000s. Books like Doing School or The Price of Privilege, right? Madeline, Denise Clark Pope is the first one. Madeline Levine is the second one. These books are coming out in the early 2000s or even in 1999. And they're already talking about how miserable the culture of, sort of this culture of achievement has made kids. Like, so I'm already talking about a mental health crisis, and I'm not even talking about social media.
Right.
So it's just gotten like 10 times worse.
In going over your book, that's something that really stuck with me is I reading that, and you keep zigzagging because parts of it are so clearly outdated in terms of where the emphasis of the drama is right now in colleges. And you can tell that it was written in a very different period and with a very different focus. And other ones are, this is the exact psychology of the students that we're seeing today. And it was such an interesting experience and depressing in disabusing me of what little hope I have that all this flow of reports and articles and books about the state of mental unwellness in universities is going to lead to some structural change. We already knew about this, and people, I mean, it's not this because it's potentially different, but things don't necessarily change just because you're aware of them.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've spoken, I've had a lot of colleges and universities, but also at a fair number of fancy private high schools. They bring me in to try to like calm the kids down, preach some message of, some kind of self-development, but they don't change structurally, right? They can't. And in fact, one of the most expensive, prestigious private schools in the country, which I shall not name, showed me an internal document they had circulated where they talked about the mental health crisis among their students and the intellectual crisis in the sense of, we're not giving them the education we want to give them. And I think the people, the teachers and administrators who work at these kinds of schools, they're really committed to education. I really think they are. So they're very distressed about this. And they said, look, if we could really address these two things, make our kids happier and give them a deeper intellectual experience, but at the cost of our stellar Ivy League admissions record, right? I mean, something like 12% of the kids were getting into Harvard or something like that. Would our community, quote unquote, meaning our parents, would they go for it? And they answered the question. They didn't just ask the question, they answered it. And the answer was no. The answer was no. So, yeah. What I think we've gotten instead, because we're not getting structural change because we can't, as long as this logic of, sort of the success disease continues, is palliation. Bring in Bill Deresiewicz to give a talk, hire some more counselors, hold some more hands, or at the college level to circle
assign excellent sheep to every student.
Sure. Or at the college level, something that we've touched on already, probably at the high school level too. The DEI bureaucracy, the Title IX, trauma reduction, trauma informed, again, Abigail Schreier, sort of the whole mental health for children bureaucracy. That's what we've been doing, right? I remember giving an interview. It was for one of the crappy cable networks. I forget which one, but the interviewer said, so what should we do? Should we have kids do yoga? No, don't have kids do yoga. Don't put them through this. Yeah. That's what we should do. But that seems to be beyond the realm of possibility.
So what do we do? Do we just try to fix things in our own private lives? Do I, if I have kids, make sure to kill the notion of going to an elite university from day one and try to encourage my immediate circle to do the same, and then eat the cost, whatever they might be in my child's life in the future? I have the benefit of dual citizenship, so I can send them to study in Israel, where I think the quality of education is just better and cheaper and more mentally healthy, at least at that moment, if there is an Israel 15 years, 16 years, 18 years from now. But what's our prescription to listeners who might have kids, who might be about to go to college?
Or to our hosts, to us. Tell us what to do, Bill.
Yeah, but look, this moment always arrives anytime I talk about this, Rob. Of course it does. Right. And what I always say is I don't really believe in systemic solutions in the sense, are they possible? Will they happen? More to the point, is my book going to instigate a systemic solution. Even more to the point, maybe someday we'll have a systemic solution.
Will your book be the Tumblr of the correction?
Right. Or as you know, if you read the new preface to the 10th anniversary edition, I end by saying, look, it would be great if we could change these things, but kids, you can't wait for the grown-ups to pull their heads out of their asses. For one thing, you're in it right now. So what are you going to do right now? And it's the same thing with parents. But the real argument of the book, and this is sort of me, the teacher who ultimately cares about individual students. It's not that I don't care about society, but as I've just suggested, I feel it's almost like a fool's errand to care about society in the expectation that you're going to change it. I care about individual kids. As a writer, I care about individual readers. And my point to kids over and over again is you actually have freedom to make choices. Everything about the system has led you to believe that you have to do these 368 things, otherwise you'll end up sleeping under a bridge. And it's a big fat lie. And you need to know, you do need to know, and Adam, you gestured towards this, that if you make a choice that's more fulfilling, you will probably have to give up some quantum of not just status, but wealth. But you're already, it's a trade-off, and it's not an easy one, but you're already making a trade-off, right? If you go the other way, you're giving up. I mean, I'm sure like you, I don't like to use the word happiness, but I mean, it's a real thing, like fulfillment, like feeling like you're living a life that's the right life for you, not hating your job. Like those are all real things. And I think, without being reckless with your life or without being more reckless than you feel you can stand, it's worth making that trade-off.
So much of the problem is that people grow up, I think, not seeing the alternative and also not being raised to understand that life comes with trade-offs. We were just talking about this yesterday in our interview, and I think this is such a fundamental problem in, I'd say, society at large, not just in our education choices, in our politics. The idea of trade-offs, the idea that you can't have it all, is anathema to our culture.
And specifically to the way that we educate our quote unquote best and brightest. Like kids are literally, kids from that class, of course, most kids get a very different message, but kids from that class are literally told you can do whatever you want, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I was never going to be the center fielder for the Yankees, which is what I wanted when I was, 12, or probably a concert pianist or many, many other things. It's absurd. And I agree with you. There's so much, this connects to so many elements of our culture, but it's fundamentally a loss of the tragic sense of life.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? The sense that life involves losses, life involves trade-offs.
Right.
But let me also say, so I say this to kids and I try to say this to parents, and it's much harder for parents to hear also. Like, they are so concerned about their kids. They think that they need to do X and Y for their kids. And I try to just get them to see, like, look at where your kid is at now. Like, that there's a problem here. Especially because like when I'm brought to speak at these schools, like sometimes the kids have to come, but the parents, it's always voluntary. It's usually mothers more than fathers. And like, you're here because there's a problem with your kid already. And I'll also say both to parents and to kids, like the parents will say, like, trust your kids more. And to kids will say, trust yourself more. To the parents, I'll say, you were 15. Think about yourself when you were 15. If you looked at your own 15-year-old self, you would see someone who's completely incapable, lost, blah, blah, blah. But you managed. Here you are. You did okay. And to kids, I'll say, like, look at these adults who seem very successful and enviable, including the ones who you really want to emulate, who've done something interesting with their lives. They were once like you. And there are all these potentials and powers that are slumbering within you that you haven't realized yet. But they're in there. And that's why you should trust yourself more.
But also less.
You can do much more than you think you can.
But also less.
Okay.
What do you mean?
Maybe trust your judgment less and your abilities more.
Right. I think that's the difficulty, because in this balance, because
I'm not sure kids trust themselves very much, even in terms of their judgment.
I think it's difficult because I think the cliche of you can do whatever you want is an attempt to instill a sense of confidence in kids to be able to stand up straight and meet the world with strength, and not necessarily to be taken as literally as the Disney interpretation might suggest, that the entire menu of possibilities is available to you. I think there's
I'm not sure kids understand that.
Right. But also, I don't think parents are being honest. When they say you can do whatever you want, it's you can do whatever I think you should do. It's like it's in this circumscribed bucket of these are the elite type of jobs that I am imagining that you can do. And there's also the, like you were saying, though, like the fear mongering of like, and if you don't do all of these things in order to get to that place, you're going to be living under a bridge, or you're like the world is going to be over. And like, I see this. I have a colleague I work with who kind of puts this pressure on their kid to not play video games, and I don't want to like diminish that it's really hard when your kid is struggling or has mental health issues, that you see them just like hanging out, not doing productive things. Like that must be stressful, especially if they're not feeling happy. But on the other hand, like that is part of what childhood is about. It's about being bored. It's about being unhappy. It's about finding things that give you meaning. And the expectation that you have to spend every day packing your day so that you'll one day get into this high, it may not be high paid job, but this like prestigious job is not necessarily healthy. Like I think like the fact that he could go on to be a laborer if he wanted and have a very good life has never entered this person's mind, I'm assuming.
But I would also say, because Adam, you were talking about, I mean, what we can also call the culture of self-esteem, which seems to involve just blowing just a continuous stream of smoke up your kid's ass about how wonderful they are. But that's not what creates self-esteem or self-efficacy or whatever you want to. What creates it is like doing things, especially things that are self-directed, and failing or succeeding, falling down and then standing up again, knowing that you are capable. And that's how you come to have confidence in yourself and an ability to operate in the world. And then to what Vanessa was just saying, it's just incredible that we've gotten to this point. I mean, we really need a wholesale reconstruction of parenthood and how parenthood understands itself, because we've gotten to this point where we think, I actually grew up like this myself. Like if you have the grades, like in other words, like all we're thinking about is the transcript. All we're thinking about is the resume. We're not thinking about the person. Like what really makes for success in life, success in the broadest sense, and maybe even success in the narrowest sense. Like what is it? Is it just the things reflected in your resume? Like, no, now we've started talking about things like grit and that kind of crap. But I mean, it really is character, right? I mean, that's a real thing. Like your ability to have a successful life is about so much more. And somehow we've completely forgotten that. Like we want someone who's strong. We want someone who's independent. We want someone who has a modicum of good judgment. But we're not preparing kids for any of that stuff.
You know, this is going...
Which I think you do. Sorry, let me just finish the thought. Which I think you do by having a childhood where there is time for all the things. I mean, I would take away all the screens. I don't want kids just playing video games. But if you take away the screens and don't give them so much homework that they have to spend all their time doing it, then they're going to have to like start figuring shit out for themselves. And like they're kids, they're human beings. So they're actually going to be interested in things. They're going to be interested in going off and playing with their friends and like having projects with their friends, or they're introverts. So they're going to have projects with themselves. They're going to want to play guitar or start a rock collection or whatever the hell it's going to be. They'll develop
the capacity for an internal monologue, at least.
Well, but they will do that, but they will also have interests, their own intrinsic interests. If given a chance, they will develop them because they're human beings. And once you develop those things and you start to put them into practice, then all the things that are involved in living a life, again, the risk, the failure, the judgment, the problem solving, all of that stuff, that's just going to naturally happen. But you need to create room for it by reducing the schoolwork and reducing the screens.
I think that what Vanessa said is essential to something that I'm still trying to figure out how to put into words, and I'll probably play with this over time. It's that the dishonesty about how what for instance, in a phrase like you can do what you want, that it's a dishonesty that is the real problem, that there is a dissonance that the child experiences between the messaging and the reality already, even in this cliche that is fundamentally problematic and maybe not even the cliche that you want to instill, but even there, the child is experiencing a lie and a dishonest pressure. And I think if you go a step deeper, I think there's a problem in how we even talk about these problems in English. I'm specifically, I do mean it in English because I feel like I don't know if it's an American problem or an Anglophonic problem, but I know that it's not a problem in Hebrew. And I suspect that it's not necessarily a problem in other cultures, in other different language cultures, where the words we attribute to things when it comes to our life path end up being reduced into really shallow self-help cliches rather than more vague, inscrutable, mysterious words that give us a more poetic direction. And I think of, like, even when you said grit, people are talking about grit. The moment the idea of grit gets discussed, it's not really, it loses any kind of grit. It becomes into something that will be the subject of 17 self-help books rather than here's something that you need to explore within the chaos of your soul and figure out and find your balance with encountering society. And this is just kind of a vague category that tries to capture this nebulous interaction. No, it's something very specific, grit. And here are the 4 ways that you can achieve grit.
Right.
So I don't know how to put it exactly into a more clear framework.
Is there a phrase in Hebrew that you're thinking of that is like antithetical?
It's not the phrase. This is why it's difficult for me to talk about, because it's totally in the in the vagueness of how words taste. But and
I'm also not sure. I mean, I'm not sure the problem is inherent in the English language. I think, well, certainly the American culture as it's come to exist now, because, we used to have very strong religious traditions.
I want to just clarify that I'm talking about the modern spoken English, and just to tie it in to something that Vanessa and I sometimes talk about. I have such a weird discomfort when I use the words, which in Hebrew are some of my favorite words, community and friends in Hebrew. And the problem isn't because there's something wrong about the way those words ring in English. If I read Shakespeare and I encounter the word friend, it's beautiful and has a richness to it. And you can see how the word friend changes in over the periods in English, in different usages and different qualities, and they're all textured and beautiful. And then I feel like those words, community and friend, become at some point in English, to the point that we live in now, something corporate, something coded. Community is the thing that you have with your coworkers. Yeah, your company is your community. The friends are the people that you have coffee with at break. Everything becomes part of a corporate infomercial.
Right. So a word that occurs to me as you've been saying this is optimizing. We have this culture of optimization. And anything, I think what you're saying, or at least what I get from what you're saying, is that anything, whether it's grit or friends or whatever, gets fed into this culture of optimization, whereas what we really need to surrender is the whole idea of optimization. I mean, obviously it's relevant to certain very narrow context, blah, blah, blah. But like, if you're thinking about optimizing your life, you've already lost.
Right.
And we need to help kids understand that their goal is not to optimize, right? And it's hard to talk about this in ways that don't feel kind of touchy-feely. And my work has been criticized on that score by idiots. But
that it's not touchy-feely enough?
it's
too touchy-feely, right? Oh, I'm talking about the soul. I don't know what the soul is. Okay, well, you don't know what the soul is because you don't have a soul. Okay, that's the problem. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there's this thing that's beyond whatever it is that we're trying to optimize.
Yeah.
And that education should be about addressing and helping to develop.
It's interesting. I'm not going to get into this because we've already past time, and I don't want to take us on this tangent. But I will briefly say that I recently went on a psychedelic journey, and as part of my preparation for the psychedelic journey, my guide asked me to write the story of my life, which was a very loaded prompt. And then 4 pages later, it was like question 1 on like a 30 thing form. And it was very interesting and enlightening exercise, because when one goes down to write the story of one's life, you're never putting down, what you did at your job. You're never putting down what the grades you got, how many things you've accomplished. Rarely the things you've accomplished. Like only 1 or 2 things might have made it into the story of my life. But really, what it was a catalog of my relationships with people over the past 35 years that I've lived, and the kind of emotional trajectory that I've gone on in 35 years. And I think that, the psychedelic journey was a whole other layer of perspective on life and everything. But just even that initial exercise was such a perspective shift, and is so difficult to hold on to that perspective when one is in the day-to-day of getting shit done and optimizing and producing. We must produce and 17 text messages and I'm producing this and the other. Yeah. And it's, I think what theoretically what an education should do is provide a kind of framework for that understanding of what a life well lived is. Like that is kind of like the fundamental philosophical question.
Yes.
And it's just when we forget, we just forget to grapple with it.
A framework for cultivation of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. These, we've jammed ourselves up into these, big questions that seem so, what is a life well lived? What is life supposed to look like? What are the important things in life? But of course, these are exactly the kinds of things that college students should be helped to start to think about, right? That's the point. Not told the answers, but helped to start to think about. And when you try to bring that project into the modern university or into the neoliberal conception of life or into this sort of woke paradigm, it just doesn't even make any sense. There's no, you can't even process that. But it's, right? None of those frameworks can even understand what that means. But this is what, to me, this is the ultimate justification of college. There is a very important vocational purpose and a purpose of social mobility. But insofar as we're committed to the liberal arts, this is what we should be committed to. And it just makes me so, the whole direction of the liberal arts and the humanities over decades now just makes me so sad. Because it's become this practice of indoctrination, and the opportunity cost is just so enormous. And I just feel really bad for these kids, that this is what they've taught to think. This is what they've been taught to think like reading literature is supposed to be about.
Oof.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, this is I can borrow your phrase of optimization, your idea of the optimization society, into how
optimization mindset.
The optimization mindset, right? About how the really interesting, challenging thinking of writing of Foucault and his ilk got turned into or cheapened into wokeism. It's wokeism to some extent is the optimization and operability of actual critical thinking. I always found it funny because for me, studying Foucault is like, this is interesting, this is rich, and then when you turn to its application in the American academia, it becomes it means take posters and talk about decolonization. But maybe, but that's not the point. Especially if you really take the thinking seriously. But of course, you're not, because you need to get the 4 optimized bullet points of, okay, so what do I do with it?
Yes.
Bill, this is awesome. Everybody should read the republication of Excellent Sheep, and everybody should read The Death of the Artist, which is also fantastic. And it's
The End of Solitude as
in
well.
The End of Solitude, a great collection of essays.
Thank you.
Did I ever send you the newsletter that I wrote, Bill, after our interview? If not, I'll send it to you because I did a
Please
little
do, yes.
essay on solitude and friendship after our conversation.
Oh yeah, please do.
Yeah, Bill, it's always such a pleasure talking to you. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Likewise.
And I'm incredibly glad that you're out there writing your work and if you subscribe to Liberties, Bill frequents this magazine and journal. And I don't know, what's the distinction between journal and magazine? I'm sure there is some semantic quality.
Journal's
Sure.
longer.
Journal's longer. There you go.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you. It's always great to talk to you guys.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.